The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Michael Fox. On October 25th, Argentines voted in the first round of presidential elections across the country. The results were surprisingly close, with the leftist Front for Victory candidate Daniel Scioli beating his conservative rival, Buenos Aires Mayor Mauricio Macri, by only 2.5 points. The country now goes to its first presidential runoff ever on November 22nd. I'll speak with the Argentine political scientist Juan Pablo Ferrero about the significance of all of this and the role that media is playing in and around the elections. But first, let's go to Brazil. The Brazilian media has it out for former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party. Though the approval rating of current President Dilma Rousseff is nearing single digits, Lula is still fairly popular among Brazil. He's best known for turning Brazil's economy into a global powerhouse and lifting millions out of poverty. When he left office, he had approval ratings over 80%, though that has since dropped. A poll released last week by the Brazilian pollster Ibope found that Lula stood the best chance at winning the 2018 elections amongst a wide array of potential candidates, including prominent right-wing figures such as the former presidential candidates Aécio Neves, José Serra, and Geraldo Alckmin. According to the poll, 23% said they would vote for Lula, besting his nearest rival by 8 points. But that's not the impression you would have gotten if you had been reading the Brazilian media. The headline for the Sao Paulo newspaper O Estadão read, "Lula loses, no one wins." R7 ran with the title, "Voters who wouldn't vote for Lula in any way possible add up to 55%, says Ibope. The Ibope poll not only measured voting intentions, but also the rejection of voters. Lula was indeed rejected by 55% of voters, just 1 point ahead of José Serra and a few points ahead of Alckmin and others. But these headlines left out the rest of the story, conveniently leading with the hook that fits with their narrative about Lula and the PT, a full 3 years out from the 2018 presidential elections. In Argentina, the leading candidates are headed for the country's first ever presidential runoff election on November 22nd. And it came as a bit of a surprise during the first round of elections in late October. The leftist Front for Victory candidate Daniel Scioli had been substantially leading all the polls ahead of the vote. But by that evening, it was clear that he had only won by 2.5 points, too small a margin to win the contest outright in Argentina. Scioli hails from the same Peronist party as current President Cristina Fernandez. If elected, he has promised to continue with the policies of Fernandez and late President Nestor Kirchner. A presidency of Scioli's conservative rival Mauricio Macri would signify a decisive shift to the right. Although Macri has said he would keep many of Fernandez's popular policies, he suggested he would be in favor of increasing ties with the United States, hinted at rolling back human rights policies, and has come out against the relatively recent nationalization of Argentina Airlines and the former Repsol subsidiary YPF. Amid all of this, Argentina's Grupo Clarín media conglomerate has played staunch opposition to the current government and the candidacy of Daniel Scioli. Juan Pablo Ferrero is an Argentine lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Bath in England. His latest book is Democracy Against Neoliberalism in Argentina and Brazil, A Move to the Left. Juan Pablo, thank you so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you for having me in the show.
Juan Pablo, this is the first time that an Argentine election is going to the second round for the presidency. What's its significance and what should we expect?
Certainly. We have to start with, we have to remind our viewers the purpose of this political institution, the ballotage or the second round, is to forge legitimacy to the next president. That said, it is important to take into account that Argentina has a presidential system with proportional representation in parliament. That means that the composition of the parliament has already been decided in the first round. The second round is an election between the two most voted candidates, that is Scioli and Macri at the moment. Whoever wins will have to work out a cross-party agreement in order to be able to govern. It is another step, I think, in the consolidation of institutional democracy in Argentina. Having said that, this is not remotely the scenario anticipated by opinion polls, which is why there is an apparent sense of anxiety in both camps about what's next. So what to expect? Well, given the extraordinary result of Let's Change, the coalition of Mauricio Macri, I think the government's candidate is now the underdog. And it remains to be seen if he will put in place a different electoral strategy, because the one in place at the moment has not clearly worked as planned.
Moving on now to media. Obviously, media in Argentina is fairly polarized. Clarín is the largest media conglomerate. Can you speak to who they are, their line on these elections, and how they're potentially influencing public opinion?
Yes, a good question. Clarín, as we know, is one of the most widely circulated newspapers in Latin America and consequently in the Spanish-speaking world. It also owns Papel Prensa, the biggest newsprint manufacturer, so it has a competitive advantage against rival newspapers in Argentina. Clarín has been behind two smear campaigns in the context of this presidential election. The first one was the case of the Victory Front candidate for Buenos Aires governor, who was associated to drug lords. This story was rapidly discredited by judicial sources. The second smear campaign in which Clarín was involved related the government with a large-scale phone hacking plan involving politicians of the opposition, journalists, and celebrities as well. Again, it was at the Clarín front page and rapidly discredited by judicial forces. Both stories were published as actual facts. It was obvious that they were simply false, and no apologies were issued whatsoever. The question that remains for me is, have these media operations had some sort of effect on the electoral result? I am ultimately skeptic about the assumption that the media determines political processes. The ideological shaping of political processes is something more complex that involves a greater diversity of social political actors such as social movement and so forth.
Talk a little bit more about the country's media law. How has that affected media concentration in Argentina?
Concentration of the media in Argentina, I would argue, is a reality. Although it is clearly not a reality, it is not an Argentinian problem. It is a regional and it's global. To an extent, the media concentration reflects the unequal distribution of resources and power that capitalist systems tend to produce more broadly. In the case of Argentina, the state has often been complicit in the generation of this scenario. For example, when Clarín acquired Papel Prensa in the hands of the military back in the 70s. The new antitrust law is allowing the creation of alternative community stations, including, for example, radio and TV stations for the indigenous peoples living in Argentina. That said, the law is not sufficient to pave the way for the creation of the utopian plurality of voices. A new media endeavor, as you probably know from the Telesur experience, requires knowledge, resources, creativity, perseverance, etc., in order to be sustainable and grow over time and to capture audiences, right? We have not yet seen this happening in Argentina. The most commonly watched, read, and listened media outlets remain the very few that occupy a privileged position in a privileged market position. However, the role of the media must not be overestimated. Popular governments have been very successful in circumventing the media imposed, the mediation imposed by broadcasters, and managed to establish alternative means of direct communication with the people. Most of popular Latin American presidents have done that. Chavez, Lula, Correa, Evo, and Néstor and Cristina as well in Argentina.
Juan Pablo, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And now for the latest spin on Syria. Since Russia launched its air campaign over Syria, media outlets have criticized the fact that the airstrikes are not limited to bombing the Islamic State group. Armed forces on the ground are consistently dubbed rebels and presented in a benevolent tone, in stark contrast to ISIS. This representation is misleading. The moderates, which are appealing to a Western audience, are almost non-existent. The so-called rebels are mainly jihadi militants. Among the rebel groups is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, al-Nusra Front, which is now part of a coalition with other smaller jihadi militias called the Army of Conquest. This coalition may be serving Washington's interests, fighting both President Bashar al-Assad and the Islamic State group, but it is far from benevolent. By using the category rebels to group together the different armed factions fighting in Syria, the media is misleading its audience into believing that Russia is once again killing the good guys, while the West is struggling to bring democracy to a war-torn country. This Cold War narrative has already been seen in Ukraine. Not only is it shaping public opinion, but it also fails to explain the complexities and the interests on the ground that are shaping global affairs. As things heat up in Syria and the conflict rages on, it's important to be clear about who is fighting and not simply champion so-called rebels and moderates, because the media and US spokespeople tell us that they are freedom fighters leading the charge for Syrian democracy. That's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.